Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here for this webinar on the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on the Australian economy. To those of you who are joining us from Hong Kong or Singapore or places in those time zones, good morning to you. And to anyone who's watching a recording of this, perhaps you're in Europe or North America or Latin America, and obviously don't want to be up at some ungodly hour of the morning, well, thank you for watching this whenever you're watching it. I'm now going to share my screen so that you can see the slides that I intend to work through. Before I go on to the substance of the presentation, however, let me stress, as I always do, that nothing that you're about to hear in this webinar constitutes investment advice, and it shouldn't be construed as such. If you think I've given you an investment tip, then you almost certainly haven't understood what I've said. And before you make any investment decisions, you should consult with your own personal financial advisor who understands your personal circumstances, and you should see anything I'm saying today as being very much of a general nature rather than specific to your personal circumstances. The Australian government's responded pretty firmly to the downturn in the economy and to the virus by doing more to support incomes of households and businesses adversely affected by restrictions than almost any other governments in the world, with the exception of New Zealand, Singapore, Britain and Germany. And certainly in Britain, Germany and New Zealand, as in Australia, the biggest component of what government has been doing to support the economy has been the provision of wage subsidies through what in this country has been JobKeeper, and other countries have their own names for it. Most of these policy measures have been designed to be simple to administer, to make the maximum use of existing systems, such as those of the tax office, rather than having to invent new ones, as the Gillard-Rudd government did in some cases during the global financial crisis, and also to be readily switched off when the need for them has passed. Although we haven't got to that point now, what we will see at the beginning of next month, of course, is the level of JobKeeper and JobSeeker payments step down a bit, but the overall schemes are going to continue at least until the 31st of March, as they'll almost certainly need to. All of this additional spending, combined with the collapse in government revenues, as people aren't earning as much income from wages and salaries or profits, and hence not paying as much tax, and not spending as much, and hence not paying as GST, caused the federal government's budget deficit to blow out to $86 billion in 2019-20. Remember, this was meant to be the year in which the budget was going to be back in surplus, back in black, as the Treasurer said in his 2019 budget speech. And the most recent forecasts, which will be updated on the 6th of October when Treasurer Frydenberg brings down his delayed budget, but the most recent forecast is for a budget deficit in the current financial year of $185 billion. That represents almost 10% of GDP, which is a percentage of GDP is the largest it's been since World War II, which was to a large extent fought with borrowed money. Now, the Parliamentary Budget Office thinks that on existing policies, that is without taking into account anything the Treasurer might announce on the 6th of October, the budget will remain in deficit until at least 2027-28. That's 7 financial years away, and that net debt of the federal government will peak at almost $800 billion, or 35% of GDP in the year 2023. Now, I suspect both of those numbers will be revised upwards in the budget that the Treasurer will bring down in just over a month's time. We might even see forecast net debt of the federal government get close to $1 trillion, which sounds like an awful lot of money, and indeed it is. But there's no need to be unduly alarmed about the level of debt which is going to be incurred by the federal government. We've carried much higher levels of debt as a proportion of our economy in years gone by, especially immediately after the end of the Second World War, than we're likely to have in the years immediately ahead. And because interest rates are now at record low, the cost of servicing that debt will also be very low. In fact, the forecast released by the government in its July economic and fiscal update suggests that the government will be spending less on interest payments as a proportion of GDP in the current financial year than it did in any of the years between 2013-14 through 2018-19. Nor is the government having any difficulty financing these record deficits. Indeed, since the 30th of March, the government's debt management agency, the Australian Office of Financial Management, could have borrowed $606 billion. That is more than enough to finance this year's expected budget deficit 3 times over at yields of no more than 3 basis points. That's 0.03 of a percentage point higher than the yields that they actually accepted on about about $200 billion worth of bonds. In the last week of August, for example, the AOFM auctioned $21 billion of what were 11-year bonds. They actually got $66 billion worth of offers for that. So the last thing that we should really be unduly concerned about at the moment is the level of debt that the government is taking on. There may be a time years down the track when getting the budget into surplus and starting to pay down some of this debt is an important priority. But if the government tried to do that in the financial year immediately ahead, then they'd almost certainly make the economy worse and as a result end up with a bigger budget deficit than if they let it go for the time being and focused on growing the economy. That was the sort of mistake that was spectacularly made in Greece in 2012, but it was also a mistake made in the United Kingdom and the United States, where they focused excessively on getting the budget deficit down in the years after the financial crisis, rather than on ensuring that economic growth was actually happening in a sustainable way. The Federal Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, has foreshadowed that he might, in next month's deferred federal budget, bring forward the tax cuts that have been legislated to come into effect at the beginning of July 22, and then in the final stage of the 3-step program that the government took to the 2019 election, the further tranche of tax cuts expected to begin at the beginning of the 2023-24 fiscal year. Now, as the Treasurer says, bringing forward those tax cuts would put more money into people's pockets. There's no argument about that. But it's hard to cut taxes in Australia, where we have a very high tax-free threshold by international standards, and where the top rate of tax cuts in at what by international standards is actually a relatively low level of income. It's hard to cut income taxes in Australia without the cuts disproportionately benefiting middle to high income earners, because they're the ones who pay most of the tax. 30% of personal income tax in Australia is paid by the 3% of taxpayers who are in the top tax bracket. Now, I'm not criticising the government because the tax cuts disproportionately impact middle to high income earners. But what I am saying is that because they disproportionately benefit middle to high income earners, who are more likely to save or pay down debt with the tax cuts that they get, that this is probably not the most effective way of boosting the economy. Yes, as the Treasurer says, it will put more money in people's pockets. But what we want is for people to take that money out of their pockets and spend it in ways that will help support businesses and create jobs and keep the economy ticking over. And I'd argue for the same dollar amount as the government would apply to bringing forward those tax cuts, they get more stimulus bang for their buck if they spent it on giving cash to households who don't earn enough to pay income tax, spend it on infrastructure, or on something like social housing, for which there's an evident need and which can be dialed up or down much more easily depending on how the economy is performing. Or as an alternative, if the government provided such money in the form of time-limited tradable vouchers valid for spending in designated areas like tourism, which both the Northern Territory and Tasmanian governments have done in recent weeks, and which some governments overseas have also done with considerable success, then all of that money would be spent either by the households who got the vouchers or by the households they sold them to if they couldn't actually use them, and they'd be spent in areas where you actually want the stimulus to go. So I think there are better ways than the government's currently thinking of supporting the recovery through fiscal policy measures, but we'll have to wait for another month or so to see what the government's actually decided. There's been a lot of variation in the support provided to households and incomes by state governments across the country too. As you can see from this chart, the Tasmanian government has provided support for businesses and households through its budget, equivalent to 3.6% of GDP. That's considerably above the average of just over 2% for all states and territories, and much more generous than South Australia and the Northern Territory, which have only spent the equivalent of about 1 to 1.25% of their gross state products in supporting households and businesses in those states. Of course, different states have different capacities to spend, given their budgetary situations. The Northern Territory's finances, for example, are in a terrible mess, so it's not surprising they haven't spent so much. I guess it's also worth noting that how much governments have spent haven't necessarily affected the popularity of those governments. For example, the Western Australian Premier enjoys an approval rating of 90%, despite the fact that the Western Australian government has actually been a bit more stingy in the support it's provided to households and businesses in that state than the average of all states and territories. About 3 weeks ago, the Governor of the Reserve Bank, Phil Lowe, said that state and territory governments should spend an additional 2% of their collective gross products, or about $40 billion, on infrastructure investment. And S&P, one of the big rating agencies, said that state governments had plenty of room to accommodate that, especially at the sort of interest rates they'd have to pay on any debt they issued in order to finance that infrastructure. For its part, the Reserve Bank has gone as far as it practically can in cutting interest rates to a target of 0.25%, although in practice they've actually allowed the cash rate to drift down to roughly half that, to 0.13 of a percentage point in the money markets. And the Reserve Bank Governor has said that it's probably going to be the best part of 3 years before the Reserve Bank thinks we're making sufficient progress towards full employment and getting inflation back into the 2 to 3% target band before they actually start to lift interest rates. And the Reserve Bank has backed up that commitment by buying government bonds in order to keep the yield on 3-year bonds at 0.25% per annum. That's the Reserve Bank's version of the quantitative easing that many central banks around the world have been doing in the last 6 months. Of course, many of them started doing that during the global financial crisis of 12 years ago. Where it's been necessary, the Reserve Bank has also provided additional liquidity through its open market operations to ensure that credit continues to flow through the banks to people who need it. And they did need to do that during March, but haven't needed to do as much of it since. The other thing the Reserve Bank has done to help support the economy is provide a term funding facility, which makes funds available to banks and other lenders for periods of up to 3 years at interest rates of 0.25% per annum. And they've structured it in such a way that the more banks lend to small and medium-sized enterprises in particular, the more money the banks in turn can get at this rate of 0.25 percentage point. Last week at its board meeting, the Reserve Bank announced that this scheme, which had been intended to terminate on the 30th of September, would instead run until June of next year, and that the amount available under it would be increased to 200 billion. So far, the banks have only taken out 52 billion of that, partly because they've actually been flooded with deposits from people and businesses who, as we saw before, have saved a record proportion of their income, or who've drawn down borrowings as a precaution but didn't in the end need to draw on them fully. So the banks have had plenty of access to other funding, but the Reserve Bank expects over the next 8 months or so that there'll be a much bigger take-up rate of this facility than there has been so far. This chart just illustrates what the Reserve Bank has been doing in the bond market by way of quantitative easing to fulfill their commitment to keep 3-year yields at 0.25 percentage point per annum. They've bought $60 billion worth of bonds in that regard. They went for a period between early May and the end of July when they didn't need to do anything at all, but just towards late July and week by week during August, they've been there buying about $2 billion a week to make sure that 3-year yields stay where they want it to be. There are obviously other things that in theory the Reserve Bank could do that central banks in some other parts of the world have been doing, but the Reserve Bank's Governor, Phil Lowe, has been pretty explicit in ruling those out. He's got no appetite for negative interest rates that have been used in Europe and Japan. And I think it's worth noting that in Europe and Japan, where central banks had negative interest rates before the pandemic struck, neither of them have made them any more negative since the pandemic struck, which is what you thought they might have done if they truly believed that negative interest rates did any good. Actually, what the evidence shows is that negative interest rates distort the financial system and impose additional losses on banks at a time when you actually want banks to be reasonably healthy so that they can lend to businesses and households who need support, rather than seeking to drive them into a loss-making situation. The Reserve Bank doesn't have any appetite for so-called modern monetary theory either. That's the argument put by some, including a few academic economists and at least one prominent journalist, that the Reserve Bank simply ought to print money in order to finance government spending for as long as it's necessary. The Reserve Bank governor makes the point that Australian governments are able to borrow in the normal way through at very low interest rates in order to finance the deficits they're running, and that history shows that there's a significant risk if politicians get addicted to the idea that they don't need to raise taxes or borrow money and pay interest on it and then eventually pay it back in order to fund government spending, that they'll never be able to wean themselves off that seemingly intoxicating drug. As Governor Lowe says, there is no free lunch out of any of this, and the idea that modern monetary theory provides a way of getting a free lunch is just simply not true. Phil Lowe also ruled out intervention in the foreign exchange market to drive the Australian dollar down, something that the Reserve Bank of New Zealand has contemplated, though not actually done yet, because in their view, the currency is roughly where it ought to be. And if you think back to those earlier charts I showed you about the Australian dollar versus iron ore prices, or the Australian dollar versus the risk appetite of investors, then that's probably right, that somewhere in the low 70s is where the Australian dollar ought to be, and trying to push it somewhere else is probably not going to be especially productive. As I say, that's in contrast with the approach of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, but it's not clear that what the Reserve Bank of New Zealand is doing is actually producing better outcomes for the New Zealand economy than what the Reserve Bank of Australia has been doing here. Thank you very much for being here. You can view a recording of this presentation or revisit the slides by logging on to saul-eslake.com. I want to thank Rati Laher, my website manager, who's in Germany at the moment, for helping to put this presentation together. Couldn't have done it without you, Rati. Thank you for being here, and look forward to seeing you at another one of these webinars next month, when on the 7th of October, we'll be having a look at the delayed 2020-21 Australian federal budget to be brought down by Treasurer Josh Frydenberg, or later in the month, I forget the exact date, I think it's the 28th of October, we'll be having a preview of the US presidential election. And we'll be foreshadowing more webinars on this website later on, so please do visit the site as often as you think it's necessary. Thank you again for being here. Enjoy the rest of your day and appreciate your support.